In this video, we're going to talk about what you can do to find some relief from the depression and anxiety that is ruining your life. Depression and anxiety can completely consume your life, turning everyday tasks into insurmountable challenges and leaving you feeling hopeless and trapped. But don't worry. Today, we're going to teach you 3 powerful approaches to manage these challenges and bring balance back into your life. We'll explore how changing your thoughts, your actions, and your relationships can help you overcome these struggles. So stay tuned, and if you find value in this content, don't forget to hit those like and subscribe buttons. Now let's dive in to these life-changing strategies together. Welcome to Faith-Based Mental Health. I'm your host, Pastor Colt, and I'm here with my co-host, Dr. Ron. How are you today, Dr. Ron?
Oh, I'm doing resplendent, better than I deserve. God is good, and I'm just happy to be here. I feel lucky to be alive.
Amen. Amen. I think we are. We absolutely are. I'm not even sure if I want to ask, but what's up with the guitar?
Well, it's 2024, and we've been going at this thing for over a year now, and I just figured maybe I would just try it out and see if we need a new theme song or not. So I've been working on a little something. It goes like this. It goes, are you ready for this?
Probably not. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, you're probably not. It goes, faith-based mental health. You don't have to heal yourself. You can come with Colt and Ron. Join us as we sing this song. Everybody now, faith-based mental health. You don't have to heal yourself. You can come with Colt and Ron. Join us as we sing this song.
It's not bad. It's a good jingle. Yeah.
Not good either, though.
I like what you already did, which
Yeah.
to the listener, if you don't realize the intro that we have on most of the episodes, it was created by Dr. Ron. He's a man of many talents.
Master of none. I just thought it would be appropriate while we're talking about depression to have something to laugh at before we jump in.
Yeah, no. Get a little pick me up besides my 5 cups of coffee we talked about last episode. I'm feeling ready. So, with that in mind, let's jump into our topic for today. Last episode, we talked about depression and anxiety from a spiritual standpoint, from a time standpoint, and from an energy standpoint. And we talked about managing those two and how both of them involve the same elements. And again, we talked about spiritual, time, and energy, but the treatments are opposites in most cases. And so today we have our last 3 that we want to give the intro to, which, spoiler alert, I'm just going to say them right now. They're cognitive, behavioral, and relational. And so starting out with cognitive, Dr. Ron, what does managing or treating depression and anxiety look like from a cognitive standpoint?
Yeah, and this is where we're starting to get into a little more of the traditionally accepted models of treating anxiety and depression. I think one of the most important things to point out here, because a person can be discouraged if they're in therapy and they're not seeing results long term, is that treating depression and anxiety from a cognitive perspective is a lot like that favorite song of yours. Not the one I just sang.
I'm afraid to ask.
It's just sometimes you hear a song and it's the bee's knees and you think it's great and wonderful. But then in time, it's, oh, I can't listen to this song one more time. And it's the same thing with the cognitive approach. Sometimes the things that we tell ourselves to kick our butts, to get us out of bed, or to reduce our anxious thoughts, we need to have a smorgasbord, like a buffet to choose from, because the thing that helped me 6 months ago might not help me as much today. And so I think it's really helpful to have a whole list of cognitive things to talk about when it comes to treating depression. So if you're ready, I'll give you a couple of examples, but I'll definitely go into more detail in the upcoming episodes.
Dr. Ron, I just want to say real quick, it sounds to me like you just said something extremely encouraging because I know there's times where someone goes through, whether it's depression or anxiety, and they have a few tricks up their sleeves. They have a few tools in their toolbox that they've learned, whether from a counselor or from, who knows, a podcast, YouTube, whatever. But they've tried those things and it didn't work, and they're like, crap, it doesn't work for me. So what you're telling me is there's a lot more tools. You just need to keep learning. And when one doesn't work, maybe you're using the wrong one for that moment. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Oh, yeah, for sure. And that's why things like this podcast, for example, and books, they're for the most part, they're very helpful. You might have a thing that was very helpful for you in the past, and it just doesn't have that same punch. And so learning something new, growing and developing in these things is very important.
And that's part of our prayer. Dr. Ron and I are hoping and praying that we can be part of your growth. That's ultimately why we do this. Perfect. So is there anything else you wanted to say on cognitive as far as the managing depression and anxiety?
For sure. I'll give you an example of what I mean, a couple of examples, and then I'd be interested from your perspective, or really maybe from somebody that you know, if there are things that help you from the cognitive perspective. The idea is cognitively treating depression and anxiety is the idea of what is our inner dialogue all about. And in extreme cases, we often have to make our inner dialogue an outer dialogue. But if I'm depressed, what kinds of things do I need to tell myself that will help me to not be depressed? If I'm anxious, what kind of things do I need to tell myself to be less anxious? What I really like is when we're able to combine lines of effort. So, in my examples, I'll combine the spiritual approach with the cognitive approach and say that if a depressed person focuses on sacred texts that remind them, for example, that they are loved, fearfully and wonderfully made by a master craftsman, it can be helpful. It can be helpful to look in the mirror and remind myself that I am a person of worth and that a loving creator died on my behalf. It can be helpful to tell myself to be anxious for nothing, that there's nothing that I have to worry about. These things are helpful. With depressed people, I tell them, what do you have to tell yourself that reminds you that life isn't as bad as what your symptoms are trying to paint it? For an anxious person, it's the same thing. What do you have to tell yourself to remind you that you don't have to wait for the shoe to drop? And in both of these perspectives, what we're trying to do is PIP, put it in perspective. So for both of these, I say there's a couple of ones that kind of are universal applicable. The first is 100 years from now, will this matter? If you take a step back and take the big approach and you put it in perspective that way, 100 years, will this matter? Second one that's universally applicable is okay, what's the worst case scenario? What's the best case scenario? What's the most likely scenario? That's particularly helpful for anxiety, which is defined by what. If I can cognitively wrestle with this thing and figure out that the worst case scenario isn't really as bad as my anxiety would like me to believe it to be, then I can find some peace from the cognitive approach. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I'll comment on that real quick and just say that this is actually something that years ago you put into my toolbox, you taught me, which is I can't remember what it was that I was facing, but it's something I was anxious about, what the result would be one way or another. And you told me, Colt, just think about the worst way it could possibly go. And I was thinking, wow, this sounds like a great start to this conversation. You said, think about the worst way it could possibly go. And now ask yourself, could you survive it? And correct me if I'm wrong on how you worded it. I might get this slightly wrong, but you said, could you survive it? And I thought about it and I thought about the worst that could go. And I said, yes. And you said, okay, do you know how you would survive it? And I said, yes. And you said, would everything be okay? Big picture, not right at that moment, but big picture, would everything be okay? And I said, yeah, it can turn out all right. There's something I can do and it can still work out. Even if this thing I'm nervous about or anxious about goes as bad as it possibly could. Then you said, that should give you a lot of comfort. And it did. And as a chaplain, if only the airmen that come to me knew how many of the things that I teach them, how many of the tools I give them come straight from Dr. Ron. Yeah, that's one of the things that I've been able to share and use to help others. So yeah, it makes sense to me because I've been practicing it for quite some time.
I hope everyone takes all of these things, gives me no credit, writes them down, gets publishes a book. I care little about credit. I want more people to be healthy. Did I ever tell you about the time that my anxiety gave me a vacation to LA?
That sounds like a great result of anxiety, maybe, but no.
Okay, I had government purchased plane tickets to LA from Hawaii, and the boat, which only leaves once a month, was going to be transporting my car, and I timed it in such a way that my car would arrive at the exact time that my plane landed. And so I got to drop my car off, and the guy at the counter said, "I'm sorry, we can't load your car. There's a safety recall." And I started getting anxious, and it impacted my dialogue with him. And it was like, "What's going on?" And he told me, "If you can get it into a dealer and get it fixed, we can get it on the boat and everything will be okay." And my terse response was, "Sir, do you realize, geographically speaking, where we're located?" It was out of character for me. "We're on an island. Nobody's going to take my car today. Everyone's on island time. And it's just not going to happen." And then I said, "What if we?" And as soon as I said, "What if?" this mental thing went click. "Hello, anxiety." And I put my hand up and I said, "Sir, this is my issue, not yours. Give me a moment." And I walked outside and I went, "Okay, what's the worst case scenario?" And when walking the dog on the worst case scenario, the most helpful phrase is, "And then what?" And I said to myself, "What's the worst case scenario? They're not going to get my car on the boat. And then what?" And then I guess I'm going to have to fill out a power of attorney so my friend can take it to the dealership and then get it on the next boat. And then what? I can't change my flight. I'm going to have to go to LA. And then what? Then I'm going to be stuck in LA waiting on my car. And then what? I guess they got Disneyland there. And then what? They got the beach, the Walk of Fame, Hollywood. And then what? And then I was like, that doesn't sound too terrible. And here's the ironic thing, they did get it on the boat that day. But by the time I had mentally walked the dog through the worst case scenario, I decided that was preferable. And we stayed in LA with my car, went to the beach,
You
went
got
to Hollywood.
you got so excited about the vacation created by misfortune, I guess you could say, that you're like, "You know what? Screw it. Actually, I'm gonna do the vacation." That's
Worst
awesome.
case scenario isn't that bad. I didn't even get to best case most likely. It just calmed my anxiety. I went back in and I said, "Sir, I want to apologize to you. You're just trying to do your job."
I think the people who work in any kind of service industry would really appreciate the more and more people who listen to this podcast and click subscribe because maybe it would help them to do their job and deal with customers. But you just said something a moment ago that I think is a very big deal. You said worst case scenario is really not that bad, specific to your circumstance that you went through. Do you think that most of the time, if people would do this little exercise, they would realize worst case scenario is not as bad as their anxiety led them to believe?
It's the same thing as my mom saying, "You just wait till your dad gets home." The waiting was 100% worse. I'd rather just get it over with.
Yeah, I'm just gonna go out on a limb here and assume that neither your mom nor your dad is like still spanking you or anything like that. Am I correct there?
That would be correct.
That
I
would be
just had a
weird.
just had a mental image of them in their 70s trying.
I'm sure it was quite awkward.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it would hurt them worse than it would hurt me at this point. Like they break an arm or something.
Oh, geez, that would be tragic.
It's interesting. I'm not a big proponent of spanking in general, but there was one incident where my kids did something very unsafe. And I said to them, "You can either receive a spanking now, or you can wait for your mom to come home and you can tell her what you did." And both of them were like, "Please give me the spanking." Why? Because they would rather get it over with than face the anxiety of not knowing, because their mind will fill in the gaps with the most absolute worst case scenario. So I said, "Okay, I guess I'll give you a spanking." And I went to give him a spanking, and as soon as I pulled my hand back, the door opened, and my wife's, "What's going on in here?" And I'm like, "Kids, cat's out of the bag now. You better tell your mom what you did." And so it was.
Yeah, and that's definitely an example of the anxiety being worse than the actual result. It might also be a example of Rebecca being a little bit scary sometimes. Yeah, yeah, love her, but maybe she's a little scary sometimes. All right, let's continue on before I say anything else that could get me in trouble with her or anyone else. So that's cognitive, and if I may move forward to behavioral, dealing with or managing depression and anxiety from a behavioral standpoint, what does that look like?
If you tie the behavioral into the energy management piece, the depressed person needs to do things that will naturally give them more energy. They need to absorb that vitamin D from the sun. They need to get out and plan things in the future. They need to have something that they look forward to. So the behavioral management piece is, what do I got to do to help me with these things? And I think all of the lines of effort have to go in tandem, because you don't necessarily, when you're depressed, have the energy to do those things in the first place.
Hmm.
And so anything that would give you more natural energy, eating right, sleeping, exercising, is going to be helpful for the depression. Anything that would occupy that supercomputer of a brain and bring down your excess nervous mental energy is going to be helpful for anxiety. And so we see things like adult coloring books, for example. Well, what's the benefit of an adult coloring book for anxiety? You're occupying a little portion of that brain, so it's not going toward calculating the worst case probability. Again, I gotta say, my favorite thing is to combine lines of effort. One activity that I find to be very anxiety reducing is to pray the rosary. So now you're combining the spiritual with the behavioral and the cognitive. So in the behavioral approach, you're going through bead by bead. Cognitively, you're reciting the rosary. You're going through piece by piece, or you can do a prayer maze if praying the rosary is not you, or prayer beads, whatever the case may be. You're intentionally plodding through in a way that reduces anxiety. There is a way to pray that increases anxiety. And I don't want to necessarily step into the theological with you today, because I'm not trying to isolate the audience, but there's a way to pray that is a desperate pleading that some people interpret as fervent, that often is a
Mm.
reflection of more a lack of faith than anything else. But this form and this style of prayer tends to increase anxiety. And so there are other forms of prayer that tends to decrease anxiety. So maybe if I'm a depressed person, I want to pray more fervently. Maybe I want to seek a more charismatic experience. If I'm an anxious person, maybe I need something a little bit more liturgical in my personal life here. I'm not talking about the systematic theology. I'm talking about the behavioral approach to treating these two symptoms. And so, yeah, that's the gist of it. What do you have to do? And then coming back to combining lines of effort, going to the gym, helpful for both. So that's the idea of the behavioral approach to managing anxiety.
Awesome. And I just want to comment real quick and say that it's not to say that the liturgical approach or the more charismatic approach is better, correct. We're not going there right now or saying anything on that. It's just to say that one might work better than the other. If you're someone who has a lot of anxiety, maybe the more liturgical would actually serve you better, which is interesting because I would guess that a lot of people who, let's say the anxious person, would probably be leaning more toward that more charismatic style. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but that seems to make sense.
I don't know. And the fact of the matter is, I don't believe there's enough research that really goes into it, because for most people, the faith based and the mental health are completely separate. There's not a lot of people thinking about this thing holistically, but it would be an interesting study that I would definitely read. I'd be interested in.
That's where we come in. faith-based mental health. With that said, if there's anything else you want to say on behavioral, please do. But otherwise, what about when it comes to relational? What role does that play? Relationships, I guess is the right word, when it comes to managing anxiety and depression.
A lot. A lot, because both depression and anxiety seek to self isolate. I did a 6 year study on resilience through combat, and I measured behavioral activities that took place during combat. I measured all kinds of things, demographics, et cetera, et cetera. And the one thing that stood out was this Bowenian construct of connecting to another human being in terms of building overall mental resilience through combat. So the depressed person needs to find someone that will gently encourage them out of their state of depression. The anxious person who believes that the world is not a safe place, when they get into crowded spaces, they tend to have a lot of what we call social anxiety. And so we've got to figure out a way to connect them to someone that will reduce their overall anxiety. It's almost like these two people, the depressed person and the anxious person, need each other, which is why when they get married, typically this is what happens because they tend to balance each other out. If I had to pick one or the other, I lean a little more into the depressive symptoms. And most of my closest friends are friends that won't accept me not calling. They will reach out. They will say, "Hey, let's go to this concert. Hey, let's go do this thing." And I, being aware that it's good for me, will say, "Yeah, I need to." And most of the time, I don't want to. But by the time I get there and I'm engaged with the person, I recall and reflect on how healthy it is and how much I am having a good time after all.
So maybe this is one of the times where the opposites attracting is very much a good thing.
Very much a difficult thing. For example, everybody knows the saying misery loves company.
Hmm.
Depressed people tend to naturally be attracted to more depressed people. And anxiety is an extremely unstable element. It seeks to attach itself to someone. And so all of my work in family systems is trying to reach a place of emotional differentiation where not my monkey, not my circus. I'm not going to take your anxiety onto me. But yeah, anxious people naturally want you to be anxious. And in fact, they find it rude and dismissive when you're anxious and you're worked up, and the person that I'm interacting with, for example, or that you're interacting with, is calm as a cucumber. Like, how could you be so calm? Like, why are you not worried?
You're cold and you don't care.
And that's the nature of anxiety. But in reality, what they do need is people who are more stable or people who can bring down that nervous energy. There are two aspects that are important here: quantitative and qualitative. And I'll go into all the specs in a future session, but essentially for the quantitative, you got to view your relationships as a pie chart. And one slice of that pie chart is what I define as friendships, which are a mutual exchange of emotional energy without a power differential. Really important. And you have to determine for yourself what percentage of your pie you can manage to have a mutual exchange of emotional energy, as opposed to a mentor for whom they are pouring more into you than you're pouring into them, or a mentee whom you're pouring more into than they're pouring into you, or a family member. All of these different categories of relationships. Quantitatively, you have to decide how many can I manage effectively. And then if that's a pie chart, you got to imagine the pie chart inverted as a cylinder, because once you define the quantity, then you have to work on the quality. If there are, for example, things that you can't talk about with various people, or it would be awkward to drop in on them, then we realize, okay, there are friends for a season, there are friends for a reason, coworkers, for example,
Mm.
or mutual interests, and then there are friends for life. And what does it look like to transition people from one category to the next? Because This is where friction comes in. When someone assumes that there's a mutual exchange of emotional energy when in reality there isn't, or they try to force themselves into that corner of your pie chart, friction, or when they think there's a qualitative depth that isn't there, more friction. And so defining these in terms of what's most beneficial to my overall mental health, super, super important, super difficult, and it definitely deserves its own episode.
Yeah, what I'm hearing you say is that the relational aspect of managing anxiety and depression is extremely important to managing both anxiety and depression. It's almost like there's a creator who made us to live in relationship. It's something the listeners probably heard pastors say multiple times, or if you haven't been to church, you've heard somebody say that. And it's something I certainly believe as well. But yes, relationships are super important to managing your anxiety and depression, but it's also delicate, and handle the relationships wrong and you're going to increase anxiety or depression. Am I right?
Yes, we talk about triggers and then we talk about reasons for suicidality. And the reasons, the number one reason for suicidality is relationships. The number
I'm
two
assuming
reason for
romantic relationships
yes,
typically.
specifically, but then also friendships. The number two reason for suicidality is relationships. The
Yeah.
number three reason is relationships. Everything else way down at the bottom. And so, yeah, mismanaged relationships. And so, having the courage to take an honest audit of what your relationships are like is significantly important. And I would say 99% of the world completely bypasses.
Mm,
They are victims of their own relationships because they allow relationships to happen and form haphazardly. But I'll tell you what, who you are today is exactly who you'll be 10 years from now, aside from the books that you choose to read and the people with whom you choose to associate. And so all of this discussion on faith-based mental health has to go through the channel of relationships. It has to be developed in context. And I, even when I'm treating individuals, I invite their significant other, the other people in their relationships or in their lives that are important to them, because pathology does not develop without a context. Therefore, healing should also take place within that context. And for
mm,
me, it doesn't really matter as long as safety isn't an issue what the topic is. It's
mm.
always preferable to me to have a supporting agent somewhere within the conversation. And so that's it's a bias as a marriage and family therapist. I'm aware it's a bias, but I wholeheartedly stand by it.
That's awesome. I've actually never have not heard of someone doing that, but I love it. It makes sense. And it also builds in maybe some accountability when it's needed. Yeah, a lot of great things. I know we don't want to go down that path too much right now. The relationships piece will at least get its own episode, maybe more in the future. And to the listener, if the relational side is something that you're saying right now, man, I've definitely mismanaged that. I just want to point you to some of our earlier episodes. We were more so talking about romantic relationships, but a lot of it's very relevant to friendships as well. We have multiple episodes on relationships. And if you're watching me on YouTube right now, you're not going to see those on YouTube because they're audio only. So go ahead over to whatever podcast platform you use, Spotify, Google, Apple, whatever, and listen to those over there because you're going to see a lot of great content and amazing tools to help you to manage those relationships a bit better. But with that said, Dr. Ron, do you have any final closing thoughts about managing anxiety and depression from a cognitive, behavioral, or relationship standpoint?
I just want to echo what you said and the value of it. Today, I had in therapy a mother and daughter, and I went straight to the romantic relationship tools because reflective listening is exactly what they needed. Taking a time out is exactly what they needed. And really, to me, whatever the relationship is, you could benefit from this knowledge. Yeah, that's what I wanted to highlight.
I guess we're on the same page there. All right. Thank you, Dr. Ron. Thank you to the listener. If you haven't checked us out on serenitycarecounseling.com, I'd encourage you to do so. We always post more tools over there for you, whether it's book recommendations or whether it's actually being able to talk to a counselor or a life coach, or perhaps some of our blog posts will be helpful to you. Check us out over there. Subscribe if you haven't done so. Again, our prayer is just that we could be a resource to help you through whatever you're going through in life. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. On, for being here. We will see you guys next time.
Aloha.